Hello anatomy students, we're starting our new unit today on the skin and body membranes, and to kick it all off, I first wanted to talk a little bit about the tissue level of organization. Now, when a fetus is developing in the uterus, stem cells are going to divide and start to specialize, and they're going to create different tissue types. There are four main tissue types that we're going to talk about. They are the epithelium, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And today, after a little bit of an introduction, we're going to focus on epithelial tissue. So, first, let's review our levels of organization. So we start out with our smallest level, atoms, which make up chemicals, and molecules, which make up bigger molecules, and our cells. And now here we are talking about our tissues. Now, tissues are simply groups of cells that share a similar function. And just remember that each higher level of organization has its foundation in the previous one. So as far as tissues go, if there's a problem with the synthesis of a protein, or if there's a problem with various cells, then our tissue is not going to function properly, and then neither is our organ. And then that can affect the overall health of our individual. So as I mentioned, we've got four types of tissues, and we are going to focus on our epithelial tissue today. Epithelial tissue has many functions, but one of the greatest functions that it has is to separate the inside of our body from the environment in which we live and work and play. They are going to cover every exposed surface of our body. They are going to line all of the passageways that communicate with the environment. So that means our nasal passages, our oral cavity, the anus, our eyes, ears, and then they're also going to line the delicate internal passageways and cavities that we have in our body. So our epithelial tissue has some specific functions. Physical protection, right? So like our skin is going to protect the soft tissue that lies underneath it, and we're going to talk about some different characteristics of our skin that are going to allow it to perform that function. Our epithelial tissue, though, remember, it's not just the skin. It's also going to be found in other areas of our bodies, like glands. So the epithelial tissue there is responsible for absorption and secretion. And since some of our glands secrete hormones, these epithelial tissues are responsible for the secretion of those as well. Our epithelial tissue has receptors. The fancy word for that would be neuroepithelium. That's going to allow us to gain information from our environment, both internal and external alike. And then we have gland cells, and these are epithelial cells that are going to produce the specific secretion that our gland is going to secrete. So epithelial tissue is made up of cells, and these cells share some common characteristics. First of all is polarity, apical and basal surfaces. The apical surface of cells is the top portion of the cell. And if we're talking about a tubular structure, that top portion, or the more superficial part, is the part that is found inside the lumen, or the space of the tube. And so in my picture here, the top portion of the cell, this is the apical portion, it's the part that has the cilia. The basal portion of the cell is the bottom portion, and this is the part that connects to a basement membrane. So that's the attachment characteristic that I have listed here. The cells that make up epithelial tissue are physically connected to each other. We're going to talk about gap junctions, spot desmosomes, and hemidesmosomes. And these cells, or these tissues, are avascular, which means that they don't have their own blood vessels. Instead, they get oxygen and nutrients, and they release wastes by way of diffusion. So they're relying on the blood vessels of the tissues that are deep to them to give them supplies and to take away their wastes. And then finally, the epithelial tissue retains stem cells. So they are going to be able to regenerate or heal themselves very quickly if damage should occur. And then these stem cells also allow for specialization of these epithelial tissue cells. So let's talk a little bit about connections. The first thing that I wanted to say is that these connections are called cell junctions, and one of the main components of these cell junctions are cell adhesion molecules, or CAMs. These are transmembrane proteins. And so we'll take a better look at a better picture on these next slides. So first, let's talk about our gap junctions. And gap junctions are simply tunnels that are made by membrane proteins, and they are going to allow for the free exchange of ions and small molecules between two cells. And so that we're looking at one in cross section here. So this little tunnel here is going to allow for the passage of these ions and small molecules to run from one cell into the other. So it's going to speed the communication between two adjacent cells. So that's something that's called a gap junction. The next type is called, I'm just going to move myself down over here, is called a spot desmosome. And this is where the CAMs are going to come in, our cell adhesion molecules. And so our cell adhesion molecules, like I said, are transmembrane proteins, which means that they are going to go through the membranes of their own cells and then connect and interlock with the CAMs from an adjacent cell. And so they're going to come together like so, just like your fingers interlock with each other. And the main goal of these is to prevent the twisting and to prevent separation of the cells when they come under stress. And so if we look, these cell adhesion proteins, these CAMs, these are the ones that are in between the membranes of cell number 1 and cell number 2, and then they're connected to a membrane protein that's on the inside of each cell membrane. And then these cell membranes are connected to the cytoskeleton of their respective cells. So you have a pretty strong, very well reinforced desmosome here. So again, you've got the interlocking CAMs, which then are attached to membrane proteins that are found on the inside of their respective cells, and then those are further reinforced by connecting to the cytoskeleton of their cells. And again, their goal is to resist twisting and stretching in order to keep the epithelium intact when it comes under stress. And how are these cells staying connected to the basement membrane? Through a structure called a hemidesmosome, which basically means half a desmosome. So I'm going to put myself up here so that we can see. So at the basal surface of our epithelial cell, you are going to have a hemidesmosome. And so here you've got the cytoskeleton. Those are the little like red licorice looking like things here that are connected to a membrane protein that sits just on the inside of the cell membrane. And then you have these transmembrane proteins, the ones that cross the membrane, and they are going to physically connect our cell to our basement membrane. So that's something that's called a hemidesmosome. So that attaches the bottom of our epithelial cells to the basement membrane. So a hemidesmosome is not going to provide a cell-to-cell connection. It connects the bottom of the cell to the basement membrane. So let's take a look at the basement membrane that we have here. And so it's going to connect the epithelium to the rest of the body. And it's made up of two layers. We have a clear layer that's going to act as a filter, and that's going to allow for oxygen and nutrients to enter into our epithelium, and it's going to allow for the removal of waste from the epithelium. The bottom layer is the dense layer, and that's made up of reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are simply very thick collagen fibers that are woven into a net-like structure, and it's just going to provide strength to that basement membrane. I'll move myself back up to the corner, and let's go to our next slide. We're going to talk a little bit now about the classification of the epithelium. So the way that our epithelium is named is by two parts. The number of layers is first, followed by the shape of the cells that are at the apical surface. So that's a really important point. So by how many layers of cells and by the shape of the cells that make up the most superficial layer, the apical layer of our epithelium. And so we can have one layer of cells, which we call simple. We could have multiple layers of cells, which we call stratified. And we can also have something called pseudostratified, which I'll explain a little bit later. As far as shape goes, we could have squamous, which means that the cells are scale-like. They're very flat and thin. We can have cuboidal cells, which they could be cube-shaped, but most likely they're hexagonal in shape. And we can have columnar cells, which are rectangular in shape. So we can have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, or simple columnar.